I mean, I think the political whiplash to me here is most astounding. If Donald Trump found the cure to cancer, people at this table would be upset about how he did it. People on the political left would go crazy about how he did it. We got into this war for a strategic purpose, and now the president has gotten us out of the war, gotten an end to the war with a really good plan to do so, and a very clear win of a big victory on nuclear weapons, and we're sitting around the table complaining about it.
You answered the question about nuclear enrichment.
Of course, the details of this are going to come out. The president has a skeleton of a plan put together. There's a framework that's been put together via these 14 points. And I do think that more of the details are going to come out, more of the KPIs are going to come out as we.
The Trump administration's public relations crisis over the Iran agreement is getting worse by the day. J.D. Vance has been making the rounds on television, blaming Gulf allies for the botched rollout and accusing critics of spreading Iranian propaganda. But here's the problem. Conservative commentator Erick Erickson pointed out that the same administration defenders who spent days insisting that certain provisions would never be in the deal are now insisting those same provisions make it a great deal. The $300 billion fund they denied, the sanctions relief they denied, all of it is in the agreement. Let's watch this panel break it down, and I'll give you my full thoughts on the other side.
No enrichment. The deal says we'll talk about enrichment, and then he said there in that quote, maybe they might need to enrich for other purposes. That is, I think, something that for many conservatives has been their red line on Iran.
Can I just make a comment about this enrichment? I was following very closely the 2015. There were the JCPOA made one, I think, concession which they shouldn't have done to the Iranians, which was that they included in the language the idea, the demand by the Iranians that we have a right to enrichment on Iranian soil.
Right.
Actually, under NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, no country has a right to enrichment. The NPT gives countries a right to nuclear material, which they can use for civilian purposes, but it doesn't give anyone a right.
So did you read this the way I did, which is to say that we are conceding, as the United States, that we're going to have a conversation about that?
That's
we're
exactly
not saying
right.
No enrichment. We're saying, oh, we can talk about it, and maybe you can enrich up until this level. Again, that's exactly right, that this is something that was, for a long time, a red line. And that is, to me, one of the biggest concessions for Iran, because they believe they have a right to enrich. And we're basically saying, you might.
Abby, I think the political whiplash, to me, here is most astounding. If Donald Trump found the cure to cancer, people at this table would be upset about how he did it. People on the political left would go crazy about how he did it. We got into this war for a strategic purpose, and now the president has gotten us out of the war, gotten an end to the war, with a really good plan to do so, and a very clear win of a big victory on nuclear weapons, and we're sitting around the table complaining about it.
You answered the question about nuclear enrichment.
Of course, the details of this are going to come out. The president has a skeleton of a plan put together. There's a framework that's been put together via these 14 points, and I do think that more of the details are going to come out, more of the KPIs are going to come out as we continue to negotiate and go through this. But man, it's whiplash up here, because when we were in the war, it was, oh my God, five-alarm fire, Trump got us into this war. Now he's getting us out, and beautifully so, and you're still complaining.
The results don't match the cost of war, and that is honestly going to be a political problem for him as we get closer to the midterms and we look beyond that.
The cost of war in this case was Iran not having a nuclear weapon, full stop.
The cost of war to people at home are American lives that were lost.
Yes, absolutely. And when you go to war, having done it myself several times,
I hear you.
Do. And there is, and that's an unfortunate, I don't want to gloss over that point. That is an unfortunate aspect of combat and going to war against our nation's enemies.
It doesn't feel like the president understands the gravity of that.
I think wait a second. I think as the commander-in-chief of the United States, the president absolutely understands. And I think if you want to compare when this president goes to Dover Air Force Base and did the dignified transfers of those bodies, he wasn't checking his watch like Joe Biden was and falling asleep. So when you talk about, let me finish. When you talk about the gravity of the issue with the president, of the commander-in-chief understanding the gravity of American lives lost, that's
I want to get back on topic, because I heard, and I appreciate the regurgitation of the talking points, but we were talking about nuclear enrichment and them being closer to a nuclear weapon and possessing that uranium that we're talking about in making these nuclear weapons.
Let's start with what Erick Erickson said, because when a prominent conservative is making this point, it cannot be dismissed as partisan attacks. He said administration defenders spent days telling him the things he was pointing out would never be in the deal, and then those same people turned around and said those exact things, make it a wonderful deal. That is not a complicated observation. That is a documented pattern of denial, followed by acceptance, followed by celebration, with no acknowledgement that anything changed. And when J.D. Vance goes on television and calls criticism of this deal Iranian propaganda, he is essentially saying that the American public should not be allowed to read the actual text of the agreement and draw their own conclusions. That is not transparency. That is the opposite of it. Now let's go through the specific concession that matters most, because Abby Phillip laid it out clearly. Before this deal, Trump said explicitly and repeatedly, we want no enrichment. That was the stated red line. We want no enrichment, and we want the enriched uranium removed from Iranian soil. That is what was promised to the American people. What is actually in the Memorandum of Understanding, Iran will dilute the enriched uranium, not hand it over. And on the question of whether Iran can enrich at all, the deal says we will have a conversation about enrichment, not no enrichment, not zero enrichment, a conversation about it. And Trump himself said in a New York Times interview that maybe Iran can enrich for other purposes, for electricity and things like that, and that you have to use common sense about it. The expert on the panel made a crucial point about the Non-Proliferation Treaty that clarifies why this matters so much. Under the NPT, no country has a legal right to uranium enrichment. Countries have a right to nuclear material for civilian purposes, but enrichment itself is not a guaranteed right. The JCPOA made a concession by including language suggesting Iran had a right to enrich on Iranian soil, and critics said at the time that was a mistake. Now this administration is walking into the same concession while simultaneously claiming it negotiated a deal tougher than the one it called the worst in history. And one panelist made the point that should end the debate for anyone still claiming this was a clear strategic victory. We came into this situation with maximum pressure already in place. Iran was under heavy sanctions. Their oil sales were restricted. They were economically constrained in ways that were actually limiting their ability to fund proxy groups and advance their nuclear program. So today, as part of this deal, Iran can sell its oil again immediately. Ships are paying to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Sanctions relief is baked into the agreement. So the question is unavoidable. How is Iran in a worse position today than it was before this war started? If the answer is that it is not, then the war achieved the opposite of its stated purpose, while costing American lives and tens of billions of dollars. The one argument the pro-war side kept returning to is that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, and that is the only metric that counts. But there is a problem with that framing too. Iran reaffirmed it will not pursue nuclear weapons. That same language was in the JCPOA, and the JCPOA also had concrete inspection mechanisms, enrichment limits at 3.67%, and multilateral enforcement backed by the UN, the EU, China, and Russia. This deal has a 60-day period during which the inspections and verification mechanisms are still to be determined. Trusting that those details will be worked out in Iran's favor is exactly what the panel challenged. You are not trusting an enforcement mechanism. You are trusting that Trump will not allow it. That is not a treaty. That is a personal guarantee with no legal framework behind it. And here is the moment that really revealed the weakness of the pro-war argument. When the human cost of American lives lost was raised, the response from the other side was to pivot immediately to Joe Biden checking his watch at Dover Air Force Base, that is the tell. When you cannot defend the strategic outcomes of the war, when you cannot explain how Iran ended up with more economic freedom and the nuclear question still unresolved, When you cannot reconcile what was promised with what is in the actual text, you pivot to Biden. Every time, without fail. The American people are not asking for political whiplash complaints or cancer cure hypotheticals. They are asking a simple question. Did we achieve what we were told we were going to achieve? And the honest answer, as even some conservative voices are now acknowledging, is no. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, hit the thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on the bell notification. I'll see you in the next one.